Elizabeth sat on the massive velvet sofa in the grand living room of her London mansion. The walls, adorned with Renaissance paintings, reflected the opulence of her life. Yet, despite being surrounded by such splendor, she felt empty. Her distant gaze fixed on the unlit fireplace, and the oppressive silence of the house wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. She picked up a glass of wine and took a slow sip, trying to fill the void that seemed to grow within her. Richard, her husband, was not home again. Lately, it seemed as if he was avoiding being with her, always busy with business trips or social events that Elizabeth preferred to avoid. Loneliness had become her only faithful companion. As the sun set on the horizon, Elizabeth set the glass aside and walked to the large window overlooking the garden. The roses were perfectly pruned, a reflection of the meticulous control she maintained over every aspect of her public life. But inside, Elizabeth felt like she was falling apart. She remembered when she first met Richard, back when they were young and full of dreams. He had captivated her with his ambition and charm, promising a life of comfort and stability. And he had kept that promise. Richard had become one of the most successful businessmen in the country, but at what cost? Their marriage, once full of passion, had transformed into a monotonous routine. Conversations had become brief and impersonal, and smiles had grown rare. At every social event, Elizabeth found herself playing the role of the perfect wife, but inside, dissatisfaction grew like a shadow. That evening, Elizabeth prepared for yet another gala dinner, another obligation she faced with a mix of apathy and resignation. She dressed in a long, blue silk gown, Richard's favorite, and pulled her hair back into an elegant bun. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a flawless woman she no longer recognized. At the event, the bright lights and soft music did little to calm her restless mind. Richard, by her side, smiled at the guests, but his eyes never met Elizabeth's. During dinner, while conversations flowed around her, Elizabeth barely touched her food. She felt like a spectator in her own life, trapped in a golden cage she had helped build. By the end of the night, back at the mansion, Elizabeth stripped off the dress and jewelry, feeling the weight of her luxurious yet lonely life. She lay down on the enormous bed, which felt even larger and emptier without Richard beside her. Sleep did not come easily, and when she finally closed her eyes, her mind was filled with doubts and regrets. In that darkness, Elizabeth began to question the choices that had led her to this point. Had love been lost amidst the luxury? And if it was possible, could she find a way to fill the void that was consuming her? The night was still, the air heavy with the quietude of a city asleep. Elizabeth, restless in her bed, tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of her increasingly estranged marriage and the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. Richard was away on another business trip, leaving her alone once again in the vast mansion that felt more like a gilded prison with each passing day. Suddenly, Elizabeth was jolted awake by a faint, acrid smell. Confused, she sat up, her senses alert. It took a moment for her to register the scent of smoke wafting through the air. Panic gripped her as she realized the danger. She threw off the covers and rushed out of the bedroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was already filling with smoke, thick and suffocating. Elizabeth's mind raced as she struggled to think clearly. The fire alarm was blaring, a shrill sound that echoed through the mansion's halls. She ran down the stairs, her feet barely touching the marble steps as she made her way toward the nursery where her baby daughter, Amelia, slept. "Amelia!" she cried out, her voice barely audible over the sound of the crackling flames that were rapidly consuming the lower floors of the house. As she reached the nursery door, Elizabeth was met with a wall of smoke so dense that she could barely see. She coughed violently, the smoke burning her lungs. Forcing the door open, she stumbled inside, her eyes stinging from the heat. She could barely make out the outline of the crib through the haze. The flames were getting closer, licking at the edges of the room. Elizabeth felt a surge of desperation. She couldn't leave without her daughter. With trembling hands, she reached into the crib and pulled Amelia close, wrapping the baby in a blanket to shield her from the smoke. But as she turned to leave, the fire roared through the doorway, cutting off her only escape. Elizabeth's heart sank as she realized they were trapped. She looked around wildly, searching for another way out. The windows were their only hope. With the fire advancing quickly, Elizabeth rushed to the nearest window, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She struggled to open it, her hands shaking with fear. Just as she managed to push the window open, the door to the nursery burst inward, engulfed in flames. The heat was unbearable, and Elizabeth could feel the fire closing in around them. In that moment, she heard a voice, a deep, rough voice calling out from below. She looked down and saw a man standing in the garden, his face lit by the flickering flames. He was waving frantically, shouting up at her to drop the baby down to him. Elizabeth hesitated, her heart torn. The man was a stranger, someone she had seen once or twice lurking around the neighborhood. He was a homeless man, someone she had never paid much attention to, but now, he was their only chance. The fire was too close. She had no other choice. With a silent prayer, she carefully lowered Amelia out of the window, her hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. The man below reached up, his arms steady as he caught the baby safely in his arms. Elizabeth felt a brief wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The flames were too intense. She couldn't follow. The fire was consuming the room, and the heat was overwhelming. She tried to climb out of the window, but the smoke was too thick, choking her, making it impossible to breathe. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was the man below, cradling Amelia protectively, his face filled with determination. Then, everything went black. When Elizabeth opened her eyes, the world around her was a blur. The sound of distant voices, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the dim, sterile lighting told her she was in a hospital. Her body ached, and her throat burned with each breath, a reminder of the smoke she had inhaled. As her vision cleared, panic surged through her. Amelia! Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Fear gripped her as she struggled to sit up, desperate to know if her daughter was safe. A nurse, noticing her distress, rushed to her side. "Mrs. Ward, please, try to stay calm," she said gently, pressing Elizabeth back onto the bed. "Your daughter is safe. She's with your husband." Relief washed over Elizabeth, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. The image of the fire, the flames closing in around her, came rushing back. She had barely escaped with her life, and it was only because of a man she knew nothing about that Amelia was alive. "Where is he?" Elizabeth asked, her voice stronger now. "The man who saved my daughter. Where is he?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth with a mix of concern and uncertainty. "He's here, in the hospital, but he's in critical condition. The fire did a lot of damage, and he was severely injured." Elizabeth's heart sank. She owed this man everything, yet he was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. She had to see him, had to thank him, but more than that, she needed to know who he was. "Please, take me to him," Elizabeth insisted, trying to push herself out of bed. The nurse hesitated again, but eventually nodded, seeing the determination in Elizabeth's eyes. With the nurse's help, Elizabeth was wheeled down the corridor to the intensive care unit. As they approached the room, she could see a figure lying on the bed, covered in bandages, hooked up to various machines. The man who had saved her daughter looked so fragile, so different from the strong figure she remembered seeing through the smoke. Elizabeth's heart ached as she entered the room. She stood by his bedside, looking down at the man who had risked everything to save her child. His chest rose and fell with the rhythmic assistance of the ventilator, and the monitors beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of the precarious hold he had on life. "Who is he?" Elizabeth whispered, turning to the nurse who had accompanied her. "His name is John," the nurse replied softly. "He's been living on the streets for years. No family, no home. He's always kept to himself, but everyone in the neighborhood knows him. He's a good man, just down on his luck." Elizabeth felt a deep sense of shame. She had seen him before, passed him by without a second thought, assuming he was just another drifter. But here he was, a stranger who had become a hero in the most unimaginable way. For several minutes, Elizabeth just stood there, watching the rise and fall of John's chest, the only sign that life still clung to him. Her mind raced with questions. What had led him to this point? How had he ended up in such a dire situation? And why had he risked his life for someone he didn't even know? As she stood there, Richard entered the room. His usually composed demeanor was frayed, his face lined with worry. He approached Elizabeth quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm glad you're okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Amelia's fine, Elizabeth. She's safe. That's what matters." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes still on John. "I need to know more about him, Richard. He saved our daughter. We owe him everything." Richard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He's just a homeless man, Elizabeth. There's not much to know." Elizabeth turned to face her husband, her expression resolute. "He's not just a homeless man. He's a person, a human being who did something extraordinary. And we owe him more than just gratitude. We owe him our help." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, I'll see what I can find out. But Elizabeth, we need to focus on rebuilding our lives, on making sure Amelia is okay." Elizabeth's gaze softened as she looked back at John. "This is part of rebuilding, Richard. We can't just walk away from this." "I can't." Over the next few days, Elizabeth made it her mission to learn everything she could about John. She spoke to people in the neighborhood, piecing together fragments of his life, stories of hardship, of lost opportunities, and of a man who had once had dreams like anyone else but had been beaten down by the cruel realities of life. As she spent more time by John's bedside, something began to change within her. The luxury that had once defined her life seemed meaningless compared to the selflessness this man had shown. And with that realization, Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of a connection, a sense that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The days following the fire were a blur of doctor's visits, insurance claims, and endless discussions about rebuilding. Yet, through it all, Elizabeth's thoughts remained anchored to John. The man who had saved her daughter still lay unconscious in the hospital, his condition slowly improving, but his fate uncertain. Elizabeth visited him every day, sitting quietly by his bedside, hoping for a sign that he would wake up. In the quiet moments alone with John, she found herself talking to him, sharing pieces of her life, her frustrations, and her fears. It was a strange comfort, speaking to someone who couldn't respond, but it helped her process the chaos that had engulfed her world. But more than anything, Elizabeth wanted to understand who John was. What had led him to the streets? What kind of life had he lived before everything fell apart? She knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but she was determined to find them. One afternoon, as Elizabeth sat in the hospital cafeteria, lost in thought, an idea struck her. She needed to find out if John had any family or records, anything that could give her a clue about his past. With renewed determination, she decided to hire a private investigator to dig into his history. A few days later, the investigator, a seasoned professional named David, met with Elizabeth in the hospital lobby. He had a file in his hand, a somber expression on his face. "I found some things," David began, handing her the file, "but it's not what I expected. John's past is complicated." Elizabeth took the file, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it and began to read, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. As she absorbed the information, her heart pounded in her chest. The further she read, the more stunned she became. John had not always been homeless. In fact, he had once been a successful man with a family, a life that seemed worlds apart from the one he lived now. But there was more, something that made Elizabeth's breath catch in her throat. According to the investigator's report, John's full name was Jonathan Spencer, and he had a sister, an older sister named Elizabeth. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the page, her mind reeling. The last name, the details, it was all too familiar. She had a brother named Jonathan, but he had gone missing when they were children. She had been too young to remember much, and their parents had never talked about it, the pain too deep to revisit. But here it was, in black and white. John, the man who had saved her daughter, was her brother. Elizabeth felt the room spin as the revelation hit her. Memories, long buried, came rushing back. Fragmented images of a little boy with a shy smile, their parents arguing, and then nothing. He had vanished, leaving a void that their family had never spoken of again. How How is this possible? Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking. David looked at her with sympathy. It's not uncommon for families to lose touch, especially when trauma is involved. Your brother was put into the foster system after your parents' accident, but he ran away and eventually slipped through the cracks. It seems he's been on the streets for years. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as she tried to comprehend what she had just learned. Her brother had been out there all this time, living in unimaginable conditions, while she had gone on with her life, unaware. The guilt was overwhelming, and she felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. She closed the file and looked up at David. Does he know? Does he remember? David shook his head. It's hard to say. The years on the streets, the trauma. He might not remember much. But there are people who knew him back then, who confirmed his identity. I can arrange for you to meet them if you'd like. Elizabeth nodded, though her mind was still spinning. She had to see them, had to know everything. But more than that, she needed to be there when John woke up. She needed to be the one to tell him who he was, and who she was. The drive back to the hospital was a blur. Elizabeth's thoughts raced as she tried to process the magnitude of what she had just learned. All these years, she had believed that part of her family was lost forever, and now she had found it in the most unlikely of places. When she arrived back at John's room, she stood at the door for a long moment, just watching him sleep. The bandages were starting to come off, revealing the scars beneath. But all she could see was the little boy she had once known, the brother she had lost. She moved to his bedside and gently took his hand in hers. "John, I don't know if you can hear me," she began, her voice trembling. "But it's me, Elizabeth, your sister. I found you." Her voice broke as she spoke, tears streaming down her face. She had no idea what would happen when he woke up, no idea if he would even remember her. But she would be there, and she would make sure that he was never alone again. As she sat by his side, Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of grief and hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew there would be challenges, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. She had found her brother, and she would do whatever it took to bring him back to the life he deserved. Days turned into weeks, and Elizabeth's life became a delicate balancing act between caring for her daughter, managing the aftermath of the fire, and spending time with John at the hospital. The revelation that he was her long-lost brother weighed heavily on her, filling her with a mix of guilt, sorrow, and a growing determination to help him recover. But as her bond with John deepened, so did the tension between her and Richard. He had been patient at first, understanding that the man who had saved their daughter deserved Elizabeth's attention and gratitude. However, as the days stretched on, Richard grew increasingly distant, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. One evening, after putting Amelia to bed, Elizabeth found Richard in his study, staring out the window. His posture was tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an air of quiet anger. "Richard," Elizabeth began softly, stepping into the room, "we need to talk." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with emotion. "Elizabeth, how long is this going to continue? You've spent every day at the hospital. Amelia and I, we hardly see you anymore." Elizabeth took a deep breath, bracing herself for the conversation she knew was coming. "I know it's been hard, Richard, but John is my brother. I just found out and I can't turn my back on him now." Richard's expression tightened. "Your brother? This man. He's been on the streets for years and now, suddenly, he's family? You have a life here, Elizabeth, with me, with Amelia. What about us?" His words stung, but Elizabeth couldn't deny that part of her understood his frustration. Their marriage had been strained long before the fire, and her focus on John had only widened the gap between them. "I'm not abandoning you or Amelia," Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "But John is my brother. He's been through so much, and I have to help him. I can't ignore this, Richard." Richard ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "I get it, Elizabeth. I do. But this is too much. We were supposed to rebuild, to move on from the fire and all the chaos. Instead, you're digging up the past, getting involved in something that could tear us apart." Elizabeth's heart ached as she listened to him. She knew he was right in some ways. Their marriage was already fragile, and her devotion to John was only adding more strain. But how could she walk away from her own brother? "I need you to understand," she said, her voice breaking. "John has no one else. He doesn't even remember who he is, who I am. If I don't help him, who will? He saved our daughter's life, Richard. Doesn't that mean something?" Richard stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "Of course it means something. But at what cost, Elizabeth? You're putting everything we've built at risk. Our marriage, our family. You're throwing it all away for someone who might not even remember you." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm trying to make things right, to help him, to help us. Can't you see that?" Richard shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "What I see is a woman who's so caught up in her guilt and her need to fix things that she's losing sight of what really matters." The words cut deep, and Elizabeth felt a surge of anger rise within her. "What really matters? John is my family, Richard. He matters. I matter. And I'm not going to apologize for wanting to help him." The tension in the room was palpable, the silence that followed their argument heavy with unresolved emotions. Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and resignation. "I don't know if I can do this, Elizabeth," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can watch you tear yourself apart over this, over him." Elizabeth's heart broke at the pain in his voice, but she couldn't back down. "I need to do this, Richard. I need to help my brother. But I don't want to lose you, or us. Please, just give me time." Richard sighed, turning away from her. "Time is something we're running out of, Elizabeth. I'll give you space, but I don't know how much more I can take." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Elizabeth knew the rift between them was growing. She wanted to bridge the gap, to make him understand, but every step she took toward John seemed to pull her further away from Richard. The next day, Elizabeth arrived at the hospital with a heavy heart. She knew she was walking a fine line, trying to balance her loyalty to her husband and her newfound duty to her brother. But as she entered John's room, she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the man who lay before her. John was still unconscious, but his condition was improving. The doctors were hopeful that he would wake up soon, and Elizabeth clung to that hope like a lifeline. She needed him to wake up, needed him to remember, to help her make sense of the tangled mess her life had become. As she sat beside him, holding his hand, Elizabeth felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had made a promise to herself that she would help John, that she would be there for him no matter what. But in doing so, she was risking everything else: her marriage, her family, the life she had built with Richard. "Please wake up, John," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "I need you. I need to know that this is the right thing to do." But as the days passed and John remained unconscious, Elizabeth's doubts grew. She was caught in a web of conflicting emotions: loyalty to her brother, guilt over the strain on her marriage, and fear that she was making the wrong choices. Every day, she fought to keep the pieces of her life from falling apart. But the more she fought, the more she realized that something had to give, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Elizabeth's life had become a whirlwind of emotions, a delicate balance of hope and despair. Each day she spent by John's bedside, waiting for him to wake up, was another day her marriage to Richard teetered on the edge. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, with Richard spending more time at the office and less time at home. The distance between them felt insurmountable. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the hospital, Elizabeth returned home to find Richard waiting for her in the living room. He looked tired, his face etched with frustration, and she knew that this conversation would be different from the others. There was a finality in the air, a sense that whatever was said tonight would change everything. "Elizabeth," Richard began, his voice strained, "we need to talk. Really talk." Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy. "I know, Richard. I've been avoiding this, but we can't keep going like this." Richard gestured for her to sit down, and she did, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. He sat across from her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for the woman he had married years ago. "I don't know how to say this," Richard started, his voice softening, "but I've been doing some thinking. About us, about everything that's happened. I know you feel like you need to help John, and I respect that. I really do. But there's something you need to know. Elizabeth's stomach twisted in knots as she braced herself for whatever revelation was coming. What is it, Richard? He took a deep breath, hesitating before he spoke. When I said I'd been busy with work, that wasn't the whole truth. I've been digging into some things, about your family, about your parents. I needed to understand why John was in the foster system, why no one ever talked about him. Elizabeth felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had never questioned the silence surrounding John's disappearance. It had always been an unspoken wound in her family, too painful to touch. But now, hearing Richard speak of it, she realized that she had been living in ignorance, avoiding the truth because it was easier that way. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard looked away for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before meeting her gaze again. "Your parents, they weren't who you thought they were, Elizabeth. There were things they kept hidden, secrets that were buried when they died. They were in deep financial trouble, debts, failed investments, you name it. But that wasn't the worst of it." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as Richard continued. "Your father, he had connections with some dangerous people. People who weren't happy when he couldn't pay what he owed. When John was taken away, it wasn't because of some tragic accident or mistake. He was taken as a bargaining chip, leveraged to force your parents to pay up." Elizabeth felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. "What are you saying, Richard? That John was kidnapped? Why didn't they go to the police? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Richard shook his head, his expression filled with sorrow. "They were too scared. Your parents were afraid that if they went to the police, those people would hurt John. They tried to handle it on their own, but things spiraled out of control. When your parents died in that car crash, any chance of finding John died with them. The debts were paid off with the estate, but the people involved, they never faced justice. John was left to fend for himself, lost in the system." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as the reality of what Richard was saying sank in. Her parents had been trapped in a nightmare, and John had paid the price. All those years, he had been out there alone, because they had been too afraid to seek help. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Elizabeth repeated, her voice breaking. "I could have looked for him. I could have done something." Richard reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Elizabeth, you were a child. They wanted to protect you, to shield you from the truth. They thought they were doing the right thing, even if it was the wrong way to go about it." Elizabeth pulled her hand away, the overwhelming mix of anger and sorrow bubbling to the surface. "I should have known, Richard. I should have been told. Maybe then John wouldn't have ended up on the streets. Maybe I could have saved him." Richard's eyes softened, and he reached out again, this time cupping her face in his hands. "You can't change the past, Elizabeth, but you can be there for him now. You can help him, like you're already doing. But you have to decide what that means for us, for our family." Elizabeth felt the tears spill over, and she leaned into Richard's touch, her heart aching with the weight of the decisions before her. She had wanted so badly to believe that she could have it all, her marriage, her family, and now, the chance to save her brother. But the reality was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "I don't want to lose you, Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't turn my back on John. Not now, not after everything." Richard sighed, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I don't want to lose you either, Elizabeth. But this is tearing us apart. You need to decide where your loyalty lies. Is it with me, with Amelia? Or is it with a brother who might not even remember you, who might not even want to be part of your life?" Elizabeth felt her heart break at the ultimatum. How could she choose? How could she turn away from John, the brother she had just found, after everything he had been through? But how could she also risk losing the life she had built with Richard and Amelia? "I don't know what to do," Elizabeth admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Richard's expression softened, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Just think about it, Elizabeth. Think about what really matters to you. I'll be here, waiting, but I can't wait forever." Elizabeth nodded, holding him close, but her mind was already spinning with the revelations she had just heard. Her family's secrets had been buried for so long, festering in the dark, and now they had come to light with a force that threatened to destroy everything. As she lay in bed that night, Unable to sleep, Elizabeth's thoughts kept returning to John. What would he think when he woke up? Would he remember her? Or would the years of hardship have erased those memories? Would he even want to be a part of her life? And most importantly, could she live with herself if she walked away now, after everything she had learned? The next morning, Elizabeth went to the hospital with a sense of dread. The truth weighed heavily on her, but she knew she had to face it. As she entered John's room, she saw the familiar figure of the nurse standing by his bed, adjusting the monitors. "Any change?" Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with hope and fear. The nurse shook her head. "Not yet, but his vitals are stable. He's fighting, Elizabeth. He's strong." Elizabeth nodded, moving to sit by John's bedside. She reached out and took his hand, holding it gently in her own. "John," she whispered, "I found out the truth about what happened to you, to us. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there." As she spoke, a tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the back of John's hand. She squeezed his hand, her heart aching with the pain of lost years and the fear of what the future might hold. But in that moment, something changed. She felt a faint, almost imperceptible movement in his fingers. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, and she looked down at his hand, hope flaring in her chest. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling. His fingers twitched again, and then, slowly, his eyes fluttered open. Elizabeth gasped, her heart racing. "John, can you hear me?" His eyes, unfocused and confused, slowly met hers. He blinked several times, as if trying to make sense of where he was, of who she was. "Elizabeth?" His voice was weak, barely a croak, but it was unmistakable. A sob of relief escaped Elizabeth's lips, and she leaned closer, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, John, it's me. I'm here. I found you." John's gaze softened, and though his eyes were clouded with confusion and pain, there was a flicker of recognition. I remember you." Elizabeth's heart soared, and she squeezed his hand tighter. "I'm here, John. I'm not going anywhere." As she sat there, holding her brother's hand, Elizabeth knew that the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet foresee. But in that moment, she also knew that she wouldn't have to face it alone. She had found her brother, and together, they would confront the secrets of the past, the pain of the present, and whatever the future held. The days following John's awakening were a whirlwind of emotions for Elizabeth. The initial relief of seeing her brother's eyes open, of hearing him speak her name, was soon replaced by the weight of all that had yet to be addressed. John's recovery was slow, his body weakened from years of hardship and the trauma of the fire. But it was his mind, clouded by fragmented memories and confusion, that concerned Elizabeth the most. John struggled to piece together his past, his memories slipping through his fingers like sand. He remembered flashes, vague images of their childhood, fragments of conversations with their parents, but the details were elusive, buried beneath years of survival on the streets. Elizabeth stayed by his side, gently guiding him through the fog, helping him recall the pieces of their shared history. But as the days passed, Elizabeth knew that the time had come to confront the truths she had uncovered. John deserved to know what had happened to him, why their lives had been torn apart. It was a conversation she dreaded, but one she knew was necessary. One quiet afternoon, Elizabeth sat beside John's bed, her heart heavy with the burden of what she had to reveal. The hospital room was filled with the soft hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors providing a backdrop to her thoughts. John was propped up on pillows, his eyes closed as he rested, but Elizabeth could see the tension in his expression, the subtle lines of worry etched into his face. "John," she began softly, reaching out to take his hand. His eyes fluttered open, and he turned to look at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Hey," he murmured, his voice still weak but steadier than before. "You're here again." "Of course I am," Elizabeth replied, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what needed to be said hanging in the air. Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "John, there's something I need to tell you. Something about our past, about what happened to you." John's brow furrowed, and he shifted slightly in the bed, his grip on her hand tightening. What do you mean? Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat tight. I've been doing some digging, trying to piece together what happened after you were taken away. There were things our parents never told us, secrets they kept hidden. John's eyes darkened with confusion and concern. Secrets? What kind of secrets? Elizabeth hesitated, the words catching in her throat, but she knew she couldn't hold back now. He deserved to know the truth. Our parents, they were in trouble, John. Financial trouble. They owed a lot of money to some very dangerous people. When they couldn't pay, those people took you as leverage to force them to settle their debts. John's face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. What? But I don't remember any of that. Elizabeth's heart ached as she watched the confusion and fear play out on his face. You were so young, John. It's no wonder you don't remember. They never told me either. I only found out recently. But our parents were trying to protect us, even if they didn't go about it the right way. They thought they were keeping you safe by not going to the police. John's breathing grew shallow, and he closed his eyes, as if trying to block out the overwhelming information. So they just let me go? They didn't fight for me? Elizabeth's heart broke at the pain in his voice. They tried, John. They really did. But when they died in that car crash, everything fell apart. You were lost in the system, and I didn't even know where to start looking for you. I was just a child, and no one told me the truth. John opened his eyes, and Elizabeth could see the mix of anger and hurt swirling in them. I spent years on the streets, Elizabeth. Years, thinking I was just abandoned, that no one cared. All this time, I thought I was alone. Elizabeth leaned forward, tears streaming down her face. You weren't alone, John. I was out there, too, lost without you, not knowing what had happened. I would have looked for you if I had known. I swear I would have. John looked away, his jaw clenched as he processed her words. I don't know if I can forgive them, Elizabeth. I don't know if I can forgive myself for not remembering, for not being strong enough to find you. Elizabeth's heart ached at the torment in his voice. There's nothing to forgive, John. None of this was your fault. You did what you had to do to survive. And now, we're here together, and we can move forward. But you have to let go of the guilt. It's not yours to carry. John was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the window as he wrestled with the emotions that had been stirred up. Finally, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I want to believe that, he said quietly. I want to believe that we can start over, that we can be a family again. But I don't know where to begin. Elizabeth reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle but firm. We begin right here, John. We begin by forgiving ourselves, by accepting that the past is behind us and that we have the power to shape our future. You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. John searched her eyes, as if seeking the reassurance he so desperately needed. Slowly, he nodded, a flicker of hope in his expression. Okay, I'll try. Elizabeth smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with relief. That's all we can do, John. We take it one day at a time. As they sat together, the weight of the past slowly lifting, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. But even as she focused on rebuilding her relationship with John, the strain on her marriage with Richard loomed in the back of her mind. She knew she had to confront that part of her life as well, to face the consequences of the choices she had made. The next evening, after a long day at the hospital, Elizabeth returned home to find Richard waiting for her in the kitchen. The tension between them was palpable, but she knew it was time to address it. Richard, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. We need to talk about us. Richard looked up from the glass of whiskey he had been nursing, his expression weary. I was wondering when you'd say that. Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I know I've been distant, that I've put everything into helping John, and I know that's been hard for you, for us. Richard nodded, his gaze hardening. It has, Elizabeth. I've been trying to be patient, to understand what you're going through, but I can't keep pretending that this isn't tearing us apart. Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt, but she forced herself to continue. I don't want to lose you, Richard. I don't want to lose our family. But I can't turn my back on John. He's my brother, and he needs me. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. And what about me, Elizabeth? What about Amelia? We need you too. Elizabeth's heart ached at the truth in his words. I know, and I'm trying to find a way to be there for both of you. But it's hard, Richard. I never imagined I'd be in this position, having to choose between the family I've built and the family I thought I'd lost forever. Richard stared at her, the frustration and hurt evident in his eyes. So what are you saying, Elizabeth? That we're just supposed to accept this, to accept that your brother is going to be a part of our lives now, no matter what? Elizabeth hesitated, the words she needed to say lodged in her throat, but she knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. I'm saying that I want to find a way to make this work, Richard. I want to be there for John, to help him rebuild his life. But I also want to save our marriage, to be the wife and mother you need me to be. I don't know how to do both. Richard was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. I'm not sure there's an easy answer, Elizabeth, but I do know that we can't keep going like this. Something has to change. Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I just need to know that you're with me, that you're willing to try too. Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. I want to try, Elizabeth, but I can't promise that it will be easy or that it will even work. All I can promise is that I'll give it my best shot. Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope at his words, but she knew the road ahead would be challenging. She had to find a way to balance the needs of her marriage with her commitment to John, to navigate the complex emotions that had been stirred up by the past. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like they had a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward together. As she stood there, holding Richard's hand, Elizabeth knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But with John by her side and Richard's willingness to try, she felt a renewed sense of strength and determination. They would confront the past, and together, they would build a future worth fighting for. The days blended together as Elizabeth wrestled with the weight of the decisions before her. Her heart was torn in two directions. On one side, the life she had built with Richard and Amelia, and on the other, the brother she had just found, whose pain and loneliness echoed her own. The tension between her dual loyalties had reached a breaking point, and Elizabeth knew she could no longer delay the inevitable. John's recovery was slow but steady. Each day brought small improvements, a bit more strength in his voice, a few more fragments of memory returning. Elizabeth cherished these moments, seeing glimpses of the brother she had lost so many years ago. But with each step forward, the reality of what she had to do loomed larger. One evening, after a particularly long day at the hospital, Elizabeth returned home to find Amelia playing on the living room floor, her laughter filling the air. Richard was sitting nearby, his eyes following their daughter's every move with a softness that made Elizabeth's heart ache. This was the life she had worked so hard to build, a life of stability and love. But it was a life that now felt incomplete. As Amelia ran to her, Elizabeth scooped her up, holding her close. The scent of her daughter's hair, the feel of her small arms around her neck, grounded Elizabeth in the moment. She had to find a way to reconcile her love for this family with her responsibility to John. But she knew that whatever decision she made would have lasting consequences. That night, after putting Amelia to bed, Elizabeth found herself sitting in the kitchen, staring at the cup of tea Richard had made for her. The steam curled into the air, dissipating as quickly as her resolve. Richard joined her, his presence comforting yet heavy with unspoken tension. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you've been struggling with all of this, but we can't keep living in limbo. You need to make a decision, about us, about John, about what you really want." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I know, Richard. I've been avoiding it, hoping that somehow everything would just work out. But that's not fair to you, to Amelia, or to John." Richard nodded, his expression a mixture of understanding and resignation. "I don't want to force you into anything, Elizabeth, but I need to know where we stand. We need to know what our future looks like. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know that I can't walk away from John. He's my brother, and he needs me. But I also can't walk away from you and Amelia. You're my family too, and I love you both more than anything. Richard listened, his gaze steady but questioning. So what does that mean, Elizabeth? What are you saying? Elizabeth hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on her. I'm saying that I want to find a way to make this work. I want John to be a part of our lives, but I don't want that to come at the cost of our marriage. I'm asking you to help me find a balance, to be patient with me as I figure this out. Richard's expression softened, but there was still a hint of doubt in his eyes. And what if that balance is impossible to find? What if bringing John into our lives causes more strain than we can handle? Elizabeth's heart clenched at the thought, but she knew she had to face it. Then we'll deal with it together. I'm not naive, Richard. I know this won't be easy, but I believe that we can find a way if we're both committed to it. Richard was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. I want to believe that too, Elizabeth. I really do. But I'm scared. Scared that this will push us further apart, that you'll lose yourself in trying to save John, and there won't be anything left for us. Elizabeth reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I'm scared too, Richard, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to fight for us, for our family, but I can't do it alone. Richard's grip tightened on her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. You're not alone, Elizabeth. I'm here, and I'll do my best to support you. But I need to know that you're with me, that you're not going to lose sight of what we have. Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy with the enormity of the task before them. I won't lose sight of it, Richard. I promise. But I also need to help John, to make up for all the years he's lost. I can't turn my back on him. Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation settled over him. I understand, Elizabeth. I'll support you, as long as we're doing this together. But please, don't let it consume you. Don't let it take away everything we've built. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that their path forward would be anything but easy. She had made her decision, but the hardest part was still to come, finding a way to balance the needs of her brother with the demands of her marriage and family. The next day, Elizabeth went to the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. She found John sitting up in bed, a rare smile on his face as he flipped through an old photo album she had brought him. The pictures were a mix of their childhood memories, a time before everything had gone wrong. Hey, look at this one, John said, his voice filled with nostalgia as he pointed to a photo of them as children, playing in the backyard of their family home. I remember that day. We spent hours trying to build that treehouse, even though we had no idea what we were doing. Elizabeth smiled, her heart warming at the memory. Mom was so mad at us for using all the nails. We ended up with a pile of wood and a lot of splinters. John chuckled softly, his laughter tinged with sadness. Those were the good days, before everything fell apart. Elizabeth's smile faded as she sat down beside him, the weight of what she had to say pressing down on her. John, there's something I need to talk to you about. John looked at her, his expression serious. What is it, Elizabeth? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I've made a decision, John. I want you to be a part of my life, a part of our family's life. But it's not going to be easy. Richard, he's struggling with this, with how to make it all work. And I don't want you to feel like you're a burden. John's face fell slightly, the hope in his eyes dimming. I don't want to cause any trouble, Elizabeth. I've already taken so much from you. Elizabeth shook her head, reaching out to take his hand. You haven't taken anything, John. You're my brother, and I want to be there for you. But I need you to understand that this is going to be a challenge for all of us. We're going to have to find a way to make it work, to rebuild our lives together. John nodded slowly, his expression pensive. I understand. I don't want to come between you and Richard or Amelia. I don't want to be alone anymore. Elizabeth's heart ached at his words, and she squeezed his hand reassuringly. You won't be alone, John. We'll figure this out together. But we have to take it one step at a time, and we have to be patient with each other. John's gaze softened, and he gave her a small, tentative smile. "Thank you, Elizabeth, for not giving up on me." Elizabeth felt a swell of emotion, and she leaned in to hug him, holding him close. "I'll never give up on you, John. We're in this together." As they sat there, holding on to each other, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense that, no matter what, she was making the right decision. She had chosen to embrace her past, to reconcile it with her present, and to build a future that included both her brother and her family. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a path she was willing to walk, with the people she loved by her side. As the days passed, the weight of Elizabeth's decision began to reveal its true cost. Integrating John into her life was not a simple task, and the strain it placed on her marriage with Richard became more evident with each passing day. The balance she had hoped to achieve seemed increasingly precarious, as the emotional toll of trying to support her brother while maintaining her family began to wear on her. John had been discharged from the hospital, but his recovery was far from complete. He moved into a small guest house on their property, a place where he could have some privacy while still being close to Elizabeth. The arrangement was meant to provide him with a sense of security and stability, but it also brought new challenges to the forefront. At first, things seemed manageable. Elizabeth divided her time between helping John adjust to his new life and maintaining a semblance of normalcy with Richard and Amelia. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. Richard's patience, already stretched thin, started to wear out. He had tried to support Elizabeth, but the tension between them grew with each passing day. Their conversations became stilted, their once comfortable silences now filled with an unspoken unease. Amelia, sensing the tension between her parents, became more withdrawn, her laughter less frequent. One evening, after a particularly trying day, Elizabeth found herself in the kitchen, staring blankly at the dinner she had prepared. The house felt heavy with the weight of unresolved conflict, the air thick with the tension she could no longer ignore. Richard entered the kitchen, his expression weary. He sat down at the table, his eyes avoiding hers as he reached for the glass of wine she had poured for him. "Richard," Elizabeth began, her voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk." Richard sighed, setting the glass down. "I figured this was coming." Elizabeth sat across from him, her heart aching with the realization of how far apart they had drifted. "This isn't working, is it?" Richard looked at her, the sadness in his eyes reflecting her own. "I don't know, Elizabeth. I want it to work, I really do. But it feels like we're living in two different worlds. You're so focused on John, and I understand why, but it's like there's no room left for us." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm trying, Richard. I'm trying to be there for everyone, but I don't know how to do it all. I don't know how to be everything to everyone." Richard's expression softened, but there was a distance in his gaze that Elizabeth couldn't bridge. "I know you're trying, Elizabeth, but I feel like I'm losing you. Like we're losing each other." Elizabeth's heart sank. "I don't want to lose you, Richard, but I can't turn my back on John. He's my brother, and he needs me." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a quiet resignation. "I know, and I don't want to be the one to make you choose, but it feels like that's what's happening anyway." Elizabeth's tears spilled over, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I don't want to choose, Richard. I don't want to lose either of you, but I don't know how to make this work. I feel like I'm failing at everything." Richard squeezed her hand gently, but his expression remained pained. "You're not failing, Elizabeth. You're just being pulled in too many directions, and something's got to give." Elizabeth wiped her tears away, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "I just wish I knew what to do." Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. Maybe we need some time apart, to figure things out, to see if this is something we can work through." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "Time apart? You mean, you want to separate?" Richard shook his head, though his expression was conflicted. "Not permanently, but maybe some space would help. I love you, Elizabeth, but I don't want to keep living like this. It's not fair to either of us, or to Amelia." Elizabeth felt a wave of panic rise within her. The idea of losing Richard, even temporarily, was terrifying. But deep down, she knew he was right. The strain of trying to keep everything together was tearing them apart, and something had to change. "I don't want to lose you," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. Richard looked at her with a mixture of love and sorrow. "I don't want to lose you either. But maybe we need to take a step back to figure out what we really want, what really matters." Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of being apart from him filled her with dread. "I don't know how to do this without you." Richard smiled sadly. "You're stronger than you think, Elizabeth. We both are. Maybe some time apart will help us remember that." The conversation ended with a sense of finality that left Elizabeth feeling hollow. They had reached a crossroads, and the path forward was unclear. The next few days passed in a haze, with Elizabeth and Richard carefully avoiding the topic of their looming separation, each lost in their own thoughts. When the day came for Richard to leave, Elizabeth felt as though her world was crumbling. They stood in the doorway, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Amelia clung to Elizabeth's leg, her eyes wide with confusion as she watched her father pack a suitcase into the car. "Where are you going, Daddy?" Amelia asked, her voice small and uncertain. Richard crouched down to her level, his expression pained but gentle. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. I'll be back soon, I promise." Amelia looked up at Elizabeth, her eyes searching for reassurance. "Is Mommy coming too?" Elizabeth forced a smile, though it felt like her heart was breaking. "No, sweetie. Mommy's staying here with you. But Daddy will come back soon, okay?" Amelia nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes mirrored the turmoil Elizabeth felt inside. Richard hugged her tightly before standing up and turning to Elizabeth. "I'll call," he said, his voice soft. "We'll figure this out, Elizabeth." Elizabeth nodded, unable to find her voice. She watched as Richard got into the car and drove away, the weight of his absence settling over her like a suffocating blanket. As the days passed, the emptiness left by Richard's departure became more pronounced. Elizabeth threw herself into helping John, trying to distract herself from the pain, but it was impossible to ignore the void in her life. Amelia sensed the change, becoming more clingy and withdrawn, her once vibrant laughter now replaced by quiet questions about when her father would return. John, sensing the tension in the house, tried to keep his distance, but Elizabeth could see the guilt in his eyes. He knew that his presence had caused a rift between her and Richard, and the weight of that knowledge seemed to crush him more each day. One evening, as Elizabeth sat on the porch of the guest house where John was staying, he joined her, sitting down beside her with a heavy sigh. "This isn't what I wanted," John said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to come between you and Richard." Elizabeth shook her head, her heart aching for him. "It's not your fault, John. This was my decision. I chose to help you, and I'd make the same choice again. But it's complicated." John looked down at his hands, his expression pained. "I should leave. I don't want to cause you any more pain, Elizabeth. You've already done so much for me, and I don't want to take anything else from you." Elizabeth reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not taking anything from me, John. You're my brother, and I want you here. I just need to figure out how to make everything work. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." John's eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I just wish I could fix things, Elizabeth. I wish I could take away the pain I've caused." Elizabeth smiled sadly, tears welling up in her eyes. "We can't go back and change the past, John, but we can move forward, together. We can find a way to heal." As they sat there, the night air cool around them, Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the price of her choices had been steep. But she knew that she couldn't give up, not on John, not on her family, and not on the possibility of finding a way to reconcile the two. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. But as long as she had the strength to keep going, she believed that they could find a way through the darkness and into the light. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet, introspective healing for Elizabeth. The house felt emptier without Richard, the weight of his absence pressing down on her heart. But in that emptiness, she found a space to breathe, to think, and to begin the slow process of rebuilding both herself and her family. John continued to make progress, both physically and emotionally. He spent more time with Amelia, slowly earning her trust with his gentle demeanor and stories of their shared childhood. Elizabeth watched as her brother and daughter bonded, their laughter filling the house with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. It was in those moments that Elizabeth saw a glimpse of what could be, a future where they could all find peace and happiness together. But there were still wounds that needed to heal, conversations that needed to be had. Elizabeth knew that the time had come to confront the reality of her situation with Richard. The separation had given them both the space they needed to reflect, but it had also deepened the divide between them. If they were to move forward, they would need to face their pain and fears head-on. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elizabeth received a text from Richard asking if they could meet at a small park near their home. Her heart raced as she read the message, a mixture of hope and anxiety swirling within her. She agreed, knowing that this conversation would be pivotal in determining their future. Elizabeth arrived at the park to find Richard waiting on a bench near a large oak tree, its leaves a brilliant array of reds and golds. He stood as she approached, his expression serious but softened by the sight of her. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm glad you reached out, Richard. We need to talk." They sat down on the bench, the crisp air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. For a moment, they were silent, both gathering their thoughts, unsure of how to begin. Richard broke the silence first, his voice low and reflective. "This time apart has been difficult, but it's also made me realize how much I miss you, Elizabeth. How much I miss our life together. But I've also come to understand that things can't go back to the way they were. We've both changed, and we need to figure out what that means for us." Elizabeth felt a swell of emotion rise within her. She had feared that their time apart would only drive them further apart, but hearing Richard speak with such honesty gave her a glimmer of hope. "I've missed you too, Richard," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've missed what we had. But you're right, we can't just go back. We have to find a new way forward, one that includes everything we've been through." Richard nodded, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking a lot about what that might look like, about how we can build something new together while still making space for John in our lives. It won't be easy, but I believe we can do it if we're both committed to it." Elizabeth's heart swelled with relief and gratitude. This was what she had hoped for, a chance to rebuild, to find a way to integrate John into their lives without losing what she had with Richard. "I want that too," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "I want to be there for John, but I don't want to lose us in the process. I know it's going to take time, and it's going to be hard, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "We'll take it one day at a time, Elizabeth. We'll figure it out together." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their decisions lifting as they shared a renewed sense of commitment to each other. Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time, she truly believed that they could find a way to balance the love she had for her family with her responsibility to her brother. As they walked through the park, hand in hand, they talked about practicalities, how they would manage their time, how they would help John find his footing, and how they would ensure that Amelia felt secure and loved through it all. There was still uncertainty, still challenges ahead, but the path forward was clearer now, illuminated by their shared determination. The weeks that followed were a time of cautious optimism. Elizabeth and Richard began the slow process of rebuilding their marriage, finding ways to reconnect amidst the chaos that had become their lives. They started attending therapy together, working through the issues that had been buried beneath the surface for too long. It was hard work, but each small step forward brought them closer to the life they wanted to build. John, too, began to find his place in their lives. With Elizabeth and Richard's support, he started attending counseling sessions to help him process the trauma of his past and adjust to his new reality. He began volunteering at a local community center, finding purpose in helping others who had fallen on hard times. Slowly but surely, he started to rebuild his own life, and with it, his sense of self-worth. Amelia, sensing the shift in the atmosphere at home, gradually returned to her cheerful self. She spent hours playing with John, who, in turn, seemed to draw strength from her innocent joy. The bond between them grew stronger each day, and Elizabeth found solace in the knowledge that, despite everything, her family was healing. On a bright winter morning, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Elizabeth stood by the window, watching Amelia and John play in the snow. Richard joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they watched the scene unfold. "They look happy," Richard said softly, his voice filled with contentment. Elizabeth nodded, leaning into his embrace. "They do, and so do we." Richard kissed the top of her head, his breath warm against her skin. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Elizabeth smiled, her heart filled with gratitude. "We have, and we're stronger for it." As they stood there, watching their family play in the snow, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had made it through, together. The lessons they had learned, the bonds they had strengthened, would guide them as they moved forward. There would be more obstacles ahead, more tough decisions to make, but Elizabeth knew now that they could face anything as long as they faced it together. This was a new beginning for all of them, a chance to build a life that honored both the past and the future, a life filled with love, resilience, and hope. And as the snow fell softly outside, Elizabeth knew, deep in her heart, that they would be okay. They had weathered the storm, and now it was time to